Hi! Today we are going to read chapter 2 of The Brothers Karamazov, one of my favorite books in the entire world. So good. Chapter 2. The first son sent packing. Of course, one can imagine what sort of father and mentor such a man would be. As a father, he did precisely what was expected of him. That is, he totally and utterly abandoned his child by Adelaida Ivanovna, not out of malice towards him and not from any wounded matrimonial feelings, but simply because he totally forgot about him. While he was pestering everyone with his tears and complaints and turning his house into an iniquitous den, a faithful family servant, Grigory, took the 3-year-old Mitya into his care, and if Grigory had not looked after him then there would perhaps have been no one to change the child's shirt. Moreover, it so happened that the child's relatives on his mother's side also seemed to forget about him at first. His grandfather, that is Mr. Musov, himself the father of Adelaida Ivanovna, was no longer living. His widow, Mitya's grandmother, had moved to Moscow and was quite ill, and the sisters were all married, so that Mitya had to spend almost a whole year with the servant Grigory, living in the servant's cottage. But even if his papa had remembered him indeed, he could not have been unaware of his existence. He would have sent him back to the cottage, for the child would have gotten in the way of his debaucheries. Just then, however, the late Adelaida Ivanovna's cousin, Pyotr Alexandrovich Musov, happened to return from Paris. Afterwards, he lived abroad for many years, but at the time, he was still a very young man, and among the Musovs, an unusual sort of man, enlightened, metropolitan, cosmopolitan, a lifelong European, and at the end of his life, a liberal of the 40s and 50s. In the course of his career, he had relations with many of the most liberal people of his epoch, both in Russia and abroad. He knew Proudhon and Bakunin personally, and he particularly liked to recall and describe, this was already near his journey's end, the 3 days of the February Revolution in Paris in '48, letting on that he himself had almost taken part in it on the barricades. This was one of the most delightful memories of his youth. He had independent property, valued according to the old system at about 1,000 souls. His splendid estate lay just beyond our little town and bordered on the lands of our famous monastery, with Pyotr Alexandrovich, while still very young, having just come into his inheritance. At once began endless litigations over the rights to some kind of fishing in the river or wood cutting in the forest. I am not sure which, but to start a lawsuit against the clericals was something he even considered his civic and enlightened duty. Hearing all about Adelaida Ivanovna, whom he of course remembered and had once even shown some interest in, and learning of Mitya's existence, he decided, despite his youthful indignation and his contempt for Fyodor Pavlovich, to step into the affair. It was then that he first made the acquaintance of Fyodor Pavlovich. He told him straight off that he wanted to take responsibility for the child's upbringing. Years later, he used to recall, as typical of the man, that when he first began speaking about Mitya with Fyodor Pavlovich, the latter looked for a while as if he had no idea what child it was all about, and he was even surprised, as it were, to learn that he had a little son somewhere in the house. Though Pyotr Alexandrovich may have exaggerated, still there must have been some semblance of truth in his story. But all his life, as a matter of fact, Fyodor Pavlovich was fond of play acting, of suddenly taking up some unexpected role right in front of you, often when there was no need for it, and even to his own real disadvantage, as for instance in the present case. This trait, however, is characteristic of a great many people, even rather intelligent ones, and not only of Fyodor Pavlovich. Pyotr Alexandrovich hotly pursued the business and even got himself appointed the child's guardian jointly with Fyodor Pavlovich, since there was, after all, a small property, a house, and estate left by his mother. Mitya did in fact go to live with his mother's cousin, but the latter, having no family of his own and being in a hurry to return to Paris for a long stay as soon as he had arranged and secured the income from his estates, entrusted the child to one of his mother's cousins, a Moscow lady. In the event, having settled himself in Paris, he too forgot about the child, especially after the outbreak of the above-mentioned February Revolution, which so struck his imagination that he was unable to forget it for the rest of his life. Oh gosh. The Moscow lady died, and Mitya was passed on to one of her married daughters. It seems he later changed homes a fourth time. I won't go into that now particularly, as I shall have much to say later on about this firstborn son of Fyodor Pavlovich, and must confine myself here to the most essential facts, without which I could not even begin my novel. First of all, this Dmitri Fyodorovich was the only one of Fyodor Pavlovich's three sons who grew up in the conviction that he at any rate had some property and would be independent when he came of age. He spent a disorderly adolescence and youth. He never finished high school. Later he landed in some military school. He then turned up in the Caucasus, was promoted, fought a duel, was broke into the ranks, promoted again, led a wild life, and spent comparatively a great deal of money. He received nothing from Fyodor Pavlovich before his coming of age, and until then ran into debt. He saw and got to know his father, Fyodor Pavlovich, for the first time only after his coming of age, when he arrived in our parts with the purpose of settling the question of his property with him. It seems that even then he did not like his parent. He stayed only a short time with him and he left quickly. As soon as he had managed to obtain a certain sum from him and made a certain deal with him concerning future payments from the estate, without fact worth noting, being able to learn from his father either the value of the estate or its yearly income, Fyodor Pavlovich saw at once, and this must be remembered, that Mitya had a false and inflated idea of his property. Fyodor Pavlovich was quite pleased with this, as it suited his own designs. He simply concluded that the young man was frivolous, wild, passionate, impatient, a wastrel who, if he could snatch a little something for a time, would immediately calm down, though of course not for long, and this Fyodor Pavlovich began to exploit. That is, he fobbed him off with small sums, with short-term handouts, until after 4 years, Mitya, having run out of patience, came to our town a second time to finish his affairs with his parent, when it suddenly turned out to his great amazement that he already had precisely nothing, that it was impossible to even get in accounting, that he had already received the whole value of his property in cash from Fyodor Pavlovich, and might even be in debt to him. That in terms of such and such deals that he himself had freely entered into on such and such dates, he had no right to demand anything more, and so on and so forth. The young man was stunned, suspected a lie or a trick, was almost beside himself, and, as it were, lost all reason. The very circumstance led to the catastrophe, an account of which forms the subject of my first introductory novel, or better, the external side of it. But before I go on to this novel, I must introduce the other two sons of Fyodor Pavlovich, Mitya's brothers, and explain where they came from. That's the end of chapter 2.